Ragnir and Excalibur, two legendary weapons that I believe are going to be hugely important to the series, and that these two are the key in figuring out the secret of what's really going on at Elbaf. So chapter 1141 introduced us or gave us the names of two new weapons, Excalibur and Ragnir. And I'm sure that these are names that many of us recognized almost immediately. But in case you're not aware, Excalibur, which is the name that Oda seems to have given for the sword stuck in Lord Jirul's head, that's the same name of the legendary blade of King Arthur in our real-world mythology. Whereas Ragnir isn't quite as straightforward, but it does seem to be a name that Oda came up with as a combination of the Ragnarok and Mjolnir, both being terms that are heavily associated, heavily important in Norse mythology. And now, we already know that Elbaf is made up of and has been influenced and inspired by a whole suite of historical and mythological elements, and Oda is obviously continuing this with his choice of weapon names. And I'm sure most of you, if you've been following this channel for a while now, you will know that I absolutely love history and love ancient mythologies, so there was no way that I wasn't going to do a deep dive on these two. And let me tell you, the things that I've come away with, the things that I've taken away from this deep dive, these weapons are huge for the series and what they mean for Elbaf. But before we get into all of this, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're a fellow One Piece fan like me, then you should definitely subscribe so that you don't miss out on more riveting One Piece discussions. Okay, so let's get straight into it, and we're gonna start with Excalibur. So in chapter 1141, Usopp calls the sword that's stuck in Lord Jirul's head Excalibur. And now I've personally taken that at face value, and I've taken that to mean that that means this sword is called Excalibur. That's the sword's name. I just figured that during the feast, Usopp may have asked more about why there's a sword in Jirul's head, what really happened, and I suppose the giants would have explained, oh, that's the legendary sword Excalibur. Lord Jirul was stabbed by it during that tragic battle between Loki and King Harald. And I just suppose that's why Usopp refers to it as Excalibur. However, some of you have said that that may not be the sword's actual name. Maybe Usopp is just making a comparison, given the Arthurian legend does include a tale of a sword, in some accounts called Excalibur, that's stuck in stone, and supposedly not so easy for just anyone to take out. And so perhaps Usopp was just making a mythological illusion, given the comparison of the sword being stuck in Lord Jirul's head. And I won't rule that out as a possibility, but if that is the case, I have to say that has even greater, even huger implications about what that means for the series, because that would mean that there are some real connections between our real life world and the One Piece world. It would mean that folk tales and mythological stories and legends that exist in our real world also exists in the One Piece world. And it's all very meta, but it is somewhat possible because we have, at the end of the day, seen Kuma hold a Bible, carry a Bible, which is obviously a real-life religious artifact that exists for us in our world. So you can let me know which one you believe, whether you think the sword is actually named Excalibur or Usopp is just making a comparison. But either way, I do think this calls for a little explanation of what Excalibur represents in the Arthurian legend. So, in case you didn't know, Excalibur is the mystical magical sword of King Arthur. King Arthur, in turn, is a mythological hero of medieval Britain. He's the hero of medieval British literature. King Arthur is said to have been a legendary king, most likely of Celtic origin, who united Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire. After the Romans left Britain, this left a massive power vacuum, and it's said that King Arthur rose during this period, protecting Britain from the Saxons, who were a tribe of people who came from the north, Germanic people who came from the north. And importantly, although King Arthur is widely thought to have been based off a real person, there's actually been no evidence, or at least little to no evidence, to definitively prove that he really did exist. And due to the complicated history of the Arthurian legend, who wrote the tales, when it was written, yada yada yada, there is actually no real canon when it comes to King Arthur, meaning there are lots of different interpretations, lots of different myths. And this is significant when it comes to understanding King Arthur's sword, Excalibur. So depending on which source or which version you read, Excalibur may represent different swords. Some say that Excalibur was this sword that Arthur retrieved or obtained at a very young age, and this is the sword in the stone story. So according to this version, the sword was fixed in stone, and it was prophesied by Merlin that only the one true king would be able to pull the sword out from the stone, and it was Arthur who, as a teenage boy, that achieved this, proving his actual royal heritage. However, according to other sources, this sword that Arthur pulled out from the stone wasn't in fact Excalibur, and was just actually a different sword that Arthur broke quite soon after, and that was how Arthur actually came into possession of the real Excalibur, which according to this version, Arthur received the legendary sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. And according to that version, Excalibur represents and is symbolic of the connection or Arthur's relationship with the mystical, with the fantastical, with, the supernatural. Whereas obviously in the first version, the sword in the stone, there the Excalibur is a symbol of the right to rule, of Arthur's true kingship. And so while I do personally find these various renditions super interesting, for the purposes of its relationship to One Piece, I don't think it actually matters all too much. I don't think it's necessarily relevant that we actually find out which one is correct or which one is the interpretation that we should stick with. As is always the case, Oda's intention when he is influenced and inspired by real-life legends isn't to present a 100% accurate retelling of the legend in his story. Rather, he, picks and chooses what he likes, and he works that into his story in a manner that fits his story. And to me, it seems like Oda has been doing just that when it comes to Excalibur. Even with the very little that we know, I think we can make some connections to the various elements of the Arthurian legend. And the reason why I say this is because there's also another very important element of the sword Excalibur, because according to some accounts of the Arthurian legend, Excalibur is a sword with magical properties. Apparently, the scabbard of Excalibur is able to prevent its wielder from bleeding. This sword is a magical sword that protects its user, stops them from bleeding. And based on that information, hopefully you see where I'm going with this, because to me it seems like that's an element that Oda may have integrated into One Piece. This magical characteristic, this magical property of the sword may just be what's keeping Lord Jirul alive despite being stabbed in the head with the sword. And actually that's exactly what was said in chapter 1141. When drunk Usopp is fooling around and he challenges who can be the one to pull the sword out of Lord Jirul's head, the other giants freak out and they say, you can't do that, otherwise Lord Jirul will die because of blood loss. And sure, from a somewhat scientific point of view, that makes sense, because once the sword gets pulled out, leaves a massive gaping wound, a wound that I'm sure will result in a terrible amount of blood loss. Well, I mean, if we're really looking at a scientific point of view, I'm sure just being stabbed in the head would have killed Jirul already. But upon second look, now that we know this about Excalibur, about the real Arthurian legend, about the real life Arthurian legend, I should say, now I'm thinking when the Elbafians exclaim that pulling out Excalibur would cause Lord Jirul's death from blood loss, maybe what they're really referring to is the sword's magical properties. The fact that it's lodged in his head currently is what's stopping the blood loss from happening. It's keeping further blood loss and further injury at bay. So already we're seeing some of these real-life legend that Oda is teasing into Elbaf. Aside from these magical properties, even the fact that the sword is currently lodged in Jirul's head and that it can't be taken out. Even Usopp joking around and challenging others, who's going to be the one who's capable of taking it out. That all seems very much like a reference to the sword in the stone story. And so these connections, these seeming parallels do make me wonder whether Oda is going to integrate some other elements of Arthurian legend into the story. For example, if King Arthur was the one true king who proved his kingship by being able to pull out the sword, he proved that he was worthy. Will we see this happen at Elbaf? I've already seen some people speculating whether this mystical sword will be the power-up that Usopp receives by the end of the Elbafian arc. We've long awaited for Usopp to get a massive power-up where he's finally going to prove that he is a true brave warrior of the seas. And maybe he will prove that he's worthy of being deemed a warrior by being the one able to pull out the sword from Lord Jirul's head. Or maybe it'll actually be Loki. Maybe this is how Loki will be able to prove his innocence by proving that he is a worthy leader of Elbaf, a worthy prince, a worthy king of Elbaf, when he somehow manages to pull out the sword without causing further injury to Lord Jirul. And that about Loki's innocence links back to some other ideas I've had about Loki that I've shared in previous discussions. If you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, I highly recommend you to do so. All of these recent reveals make me more and more convinced that Loki is truly not the bad guy, and that there is something deeper going on in this mysterious feud with his father. And this leads me to the owner of the mystical sword, who owns Excalibur. So according to chapter 1136, Jirul got stabbed in the head during the battle between Loki and his father, the battle that ultimately resulted in King Harald's death. And the way that this is explained, it's clear that the Elbafians obviously blame Loki for what happened. And I think that's resulted in a lot of people reading this to mean Loki was the one who also stabbed Jirul. But I've gone back to reread that chapter and that little piece of dialogue, and I've come to realize that based on that specific wording, they never actually specifically say, they never explicitly say that Loki was the one that stabbed Jirul. It's clear they blamed Loki, but they don't say Loki stabbed Jirul. Meaning that it is very well possible, and I'm even gonna go out and say very likely, that it was actually Harald that stabbed Jirul instead. But obviously, because the Elbafians and Jirul blame Loki for everything that's happened, because they think the battle in the first place was Loki's fault, it just follows that Loki is also at fault for Jirul's injury, even if he wasn't the one that directly caused it. And like I said, I have discussed all of this about what happened between Loki and his father in another video, and there I also pointed out, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's pointed out, that the sword that King Harald is holding in his portrait looks very similar to what's seen of Excalibur. And so that's what's always made me think that King Harald was the one that actually stabbed Jirul, and that the circumstances of the battle aren't quite as they seem, or aren't quite as they've been explained to us. But as of chapter 1141, now that we also know that Loki has a very mighty weapon of his own, Ragnir, which we are going to discuss shortly, this makes me believe even more that it is unlikely that Loki was the one wielding Excalibur, therefore it's unlikely that Loki was the one to have stabbed Jirul. I mean, I think it's quite rare in One Piece for a character to have multiple weapons, or rather, no, let me rephrase that. It's rare for a character to have multiple types of weapons. You're usually a swordsman, or you might be an axeman, or whatever. It's rare that you see someone well-versed in multiple different types of weapons. And I should also state that this is more so the case when the weapon itself is significant. When you have a significant weapon, like it's so significant that it's a named instrument, and that weapon is heavily associated with the character as its wielder, it's rare that you wield another weapon. You know, it would be sort of like if Mihawk started using an axe out of nowhere instead of using Yoru. Or maybe Mihawk is even an extreme example because he's especially known as the world's strongest swordsman. But maybe even if someone like Shanks, instead of using Griffon, starts using a different weapon. And look, it's not impossible. And I guess Loki could just be the ferocious beast that he is because he's so well versed in multiple different weapons, with multiple different weapons. And maybe I'm not explaining that all that clearly, but my point being that King Harald was obviously pictured holding Excalibur, and Loki, as one of the Norse gods, owning a weapon that has heavy ties to Norse mythology. I think that makes much more sense, especially because the sword now being named Excalibur, I think that is very fitting and would make a lot more sense considering King Harald's own name, King Harald, because I think that that is also very, very important. So I've always found it really intriguing that King Harald is named King Harald. I've always suspected that this specific name must be a nod to some real-life historical figures, because we do in fact have a number of King Haralds, a number of important King Haralds in our own real-life history, specifically King Haralds who are very central to this medieval time period. So first up, we have Harald Fairhair. Harald Fairhair was the first king of Norway who had two sons, get this, known as Eric the Blood Axe, also known as the Brother Slayer, as well as Hakon the Good. And Hakon was known for his unification work, which I have to say does remind me of Haraldin's dream to unite all of the giants. And we'll come back to Harald Fairhair and his two sons a little later, but let's jump forward in our history a little bit and let's look at some other King Haralds that I think might have a little bit more of a direct connection or a more relevant connection to Excalibur. So let's look at King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England before the Norman invasion, as well as King Harold Hardrada, as well as Harold Hardrada. And now this is going to get a little confusing because these two Harolds share some history. They occupy the same period of history that we have to look at. But just remember that Harold Godwinson of England is Harold with an O, and Harold Hardrada of Norway is Harold with an A. So it's more like Harold and Harald. So this period of history is actually super interesting and there's quite a lot to it. And I highly recommend you to go check it out if you're interested on your own. But for the purposes of this video, for the purposes of finding connections to One Piece, what you should know is that Harold with an O was the King of England, whereas Harold with an A was the King of Norway, and Harold with an A tried to invade England whilst King Harold with an O was king. And this all happened in a very confusing, tumultuous period where King Harold with an O only assumed the British throne following the recent death of his predecessor. King Harold with an A invades England with the help of King Harold with an O's brother. Harold with an O's brother betrays him, sides with Harold with an A, invades England together, but Harold with an O ultimately defeats Harold with an A, marking the death of King Harold with an A of Norway, and historians have considered Harold with an A's death to be the end of the Viking Age. Only 4 weeks later, King Harold with an O is also defeated and faces his own death following the Norman invasion, the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror invades England only weeks later and defeats Harold with an O. And what you should know about Normans are that they are also historically Vikings. Normans are Frenchmen, people from the north who in turn were colonized by Vikings in their history. So I hope you're following all of this. Like I said, it is a little confusing, but the reason why I think that this is actually super important, super relevant for One Piece is because I think Oda has taken some of the various elements of this period in his creation of his own King Harold. So for starters, I think it's important to note that according to the Viz translation, the official translation of the series, Harold of Elbaf is actually King Harold with an A, or he's spelt as King Harold with an A. Now I have seen other translations translate his name as King Harold with an O, but I think it's important here to recognize that the official translation spells it with an A, because I do think it's actually quite relevant when we start to factor in some of this real life history. King Harold with an A was the king of Norway, which has much more of a direct tie to the Vikings, which is obviously relevant because Elbaf is super inspired by Viking history. And so I think this means that we can start looking a little bit more into the connections between King Harold with an A as well as King Harold of Elbaf. For starters, like I mentioned earlier, the death of King Harold marked the end, or historians consider that to be the end of the Viking Age. Obviously quite relevant in One Piece because King Harold of Elbaf, he was the one that put an end to the age of Elbafian warriors. King Harold, like of our own real world, in the One Piece world, King Harold too was responsible for the end of the Viking era. But of course, as is always the case with Oda, things are never that simple, and I don't think you can just say, this means that our Harold in Elbaf must be a replica of King Harold in our real world, because it's much more nuanced than that. Again, I think Oda has actually taken bits of the multiple Harolds that have existed throughout history, and I think we can also see that King Harold of Elbaf also exhibits traits of King Harold with an O of England, and I think we can see that by the fact that King Harold of Elbaf has been bestowed Excalibur, or I at least think that King Harold of Elbaf is the true owner, was the original owner, or was the owner of Excalibur and not Loki. When we were first introduced to this sword's name in chapter 1141, I was immediately very curious as to why a sword at Elbaf would have a name that is so closely tied to British medieval history. Whereas now, I really see the connection. If King Harald with an O of England was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. Obviously, England being where the legend of Excalibur originates, a land that was heavily sought after by the Vikings, by the Normans. And if Excalibur is a sword that represents true kingship, it's quite possible that Oda was drawing from all of this in the creation of his own King Harald. He was drawing on the really messy political, cultural situation that the King of Elbaf seems to have been embroiled in, as well as raising the question of whether King Harald of Elbaf truly deserved to be king. Alternatively, Excalibur may be a sword that the giants, that the Elbafian giants, stole from another giant kingdom in the past. We know that Elbaf in its past was a violent country that conquered the New World according to Shamrock, and so it's possible that Elbafians stole a legendary sword from a different country, from a different culture. Or who knows, maybe it was a sword that Harald received as a gift, as a token of love from his lover, Harald's mother. And this might all tie us back into that murky cultural political affairs that I was talking about. King Harald's allegiance, his stewardship of Elbaf all seems very questionable to me right now. And like I said, I have discussed all of this in another video. I've discussed my suspicions about King Harald's secret plot, who he was really working with, what his race relations with other giants are like. And based off this history of the two King Haralds, the betrayal between brothers, all the different conquests going on, I'm now really inclined to think that King Harald really wasn't the good king of Elbaf that the giants believe him to be. And on this note of King Harald not being such a good guy, I think it's really interesting that King Harald with an A, the one that invaded England, his epithet, Hadrada, that can be loosely translated to hard ruler, ruthless, tough, tyrant. All words that aren't very positive. All words that don't fit the image that the Elbafians have of King Harald, but may in fact be the correct words to actually describe the true nature of King Harald. Or maybe we should actually be looking at Harald Fairhair instead. I mentioned earlier that we were going to go back to him, the first king of Norway, the father of the two brothers, Eric Bloodaxe, aka the Brother Slayer, and Haakon the Good. So quite interestingly, Harald Fairhair is remembered quite fondly to have been the king that united all of Norway to be one kingdom, although some historians believe that Harald Fairhair never really existed. Anyways, this all leads me to believe that Oda was inspired by all of these legendary figures, that he's just gone in and picked and chose little bits and pieces of these different figures. And in this case, King Harald is outwardly a great king who is widely loved and respected by all of Elbaf, remembered very fondly like Harald Fairhair, whereas in reality, in the shadows, things aren't quite as they appear. Obviously, Harald with the two sons, Haradin and Loki, one of them being called the good one, the other one being remembered as this evil. The parallels here are also super clear. So these are some things that I've found and things that I've been thinking about in relation to Excalibur and in relation to King Harald. And if this period of history interests you, I would highly recommend another anime/manga series called Vinland Saga. It's all about the Vikings, all about the tumultuous political intrigue, the conquests going on in Scandinavia and in Western Europe. It's very good, so I would highly recommend that. And if you're also a fan of Arthurian legend, a book that I read quite recently but has quickly become one of my all-time favorites is a book named The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, a Japanese-British author, and it is only very tangentially related to King Arthur, sort of to serve as a fantasy genre background, but it goes so much deeper than that, and I highly recommend it. Anyways, these are some of the thoughts that I had on Excalibur. Now let's look at Ragnir. So in my opinion, I think Ragnir is a little easier to interpret, apart from the name being not as straightforward, not being a direct one-to-one inspiration, but I don't think it's that hard to interpret. Ragnir seems to be an amalgamation, like I said, of Ragnarok and Mjolnir. So in case you didn't know what either of those are referring to, Ragnarok is the prophesized doom of the Norse world. The Norse mythological world. It said that this is the great event where all of the heroes, all of the gods will die, and that the Norse world will be born again, renewed. So this prophesized Ragnarok has some very clear ties to what's going on at Elbaf and what's going on in the world of One Piece. We've known for a while now that there is going to be this great final war, one that's going to bring about the end of the current world as we know it before Luffy brings about the new dawn. And according to this Norse mythology, Loki, who is also a god or a semi-god in Nordic religion, ancient Nordic religion, Loki is said to play a huge role. He's going to be the catalyst for the Ragnarok. So it makes sense that the One Piece Loki now has some pretty explicit ties to the Ragnarok by his weapon. Whereas Mjolnir, interestingly, Mjolnir is the name of the Norse god Thor's hammer, his weapon of choice, his primary weapon of choice. And this is where things get very interesting, because whereas Loki has been a bit of a grey, murky character in Norse mythology, he's not quite good, he's known as the trickster, he's often blamed when things go wrong, whereas Thor on the other hand is a straight up hero. I would actually say that he is the most renowned of all the Nordic gods. He was even more popular than the all-father god Odin himself. Odin was the head of the entire Norse pantheon, and yet the Vikings actually favored Thor on a day-to-day basis. They wore the amulet of his hammer, they wore the Mjolnir sigil, the pendant, as a sign of protection, as a sign of bravery. And so I think we do have to recognize how huge it is, how meaningful it is that Oda seems to have given Loki, as in the Elbafian Loki, some attributes of Thor, the hero. I think that's very telling. And again, this goes back to my speculations about Loki not actually being a bad guy, the fact that he's not evil, the fact that he's been framed. Again, go watch my other video to listen to that discussion at length. But I do think it's very telling that Oda has chosen to give Loki Thor's hammer, a weapon that symbolized protection and strength, a weapon that symbolizes goodwill. All of these very positive attributes that are now being bestowed upon Loki despite his bad boy image at Elbaf. I also think there is an added layer of meaning if we consider the fact that Mjolnir, similar to Excalibur, has its own test of worthiness. Similar to how Excalibur could only be lifted by the one true king, Mjolnir is also believed to have only been able to be wielded by Thor. My understanding is that there are other figures in Norse mythology that's been able to lift Thor's legendary hammer, but no one could wield it like Thor. Even Odin couldn't wield Mjolnir despite being the head of the pantheon. And so in that case, Mjolnir has this idea of who is worthy to wield such a legendary weapon, which means I think it is very important that Mjolnir is now being associated with Loki, because this is as if Oda is saying Loki is worthy. And the fact that Harald seems to be associated with Excalibur and Loki with Mjolnir, both of these weapons having these legends, having these myths associated with value, with worth, who is worthy. I think that's very intriguing. Perhaps we're going to see a case where King Harald's true allegiance is going to be revealed via the Excalibur, via a sword that is potentially not of true Elbafian origin, seeing as Excalibur is actually from England and not from the Scandinavian countries, whereas Loki is going to prove that he is the true Elbafian ruler via the Ragnir, which has a much more direct, has much more heavy ties to Scandinavian history or Scandinavian mythology. I also think that the fact that Mjolnir has these mystical, magical properties of not just responding, of not just being able to be wielded by anyone, I think that's quite important to understanding why Loki now has possession of his weapon. I've seen people call out that the new giant warrior pirates were all just dumb for leaving Loki, someone as dangerous, someone as feared as Loki, with his almighty weapon. Whereas now, I think it makes sense that Elbafians had no choice but to chain up Loki with his weapon, because it was physically impossible for them to separate Loki from his weapon. And also, according to Norse mythology, apparently once Mjolnir was thrown, it would always boomerang back, it would always return to Thor. So maybe that also ties into why the Ragnir couldn't be separated from Loki, because even when they tried, the Ragnir would just just return to Loki anyways. And in this sense, I think the Ragnir is actually quite similar to another legendary weapon that we've seen in the series, the mighty sword Enma. Enma is such a ferocious sword that has a soul of its own. It's almost like a living being. And we've seen cases of weapons in the story having sort of a will of its own, but that's usually in relation to its devil fruit. Whereas Enma is a case of a weapon that was just so strong that it had a will of its own. And I think we're actually seeing something similar with the Ragnir. The Ragnir is going to be a super strong hammer, a super fierce weapon, so important, so significant that it has a will of its own, and it chose Loki as its rightful master. It recognized Loki as being worthy to wield it. And then adding to all of this, something even more intriguing, something even more interesting is a pretty big case of foreshadowing that Oda served on us in chapter 1141. Ripley mentions that Elbaf's two weaknesses are flames and lightning. And I don't think it is a mistake. I don't think it is an accident. I don't think it is a coincidence that in that very same chapter, we are introduced to this weapon, to this legendary weapon called the Ragnir, with heavy ties to the god Thor, with Thor being the god of thunder according to traditional Norse mythology. So thunder and lightning, I mean, come on. I think we have basically just been told how Loki is going to bring about the Ragnarok, how he is going to bring about the end of Elbaf. And I have to say, I really cannot wait. Anyways, these have been some of my thoughts on the two new weapons, on Excalibur and Ragnir. If you have any thoughts of your own, I'd love to hear it, so leave a comment below. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, please like and share the video. Please also subscribe so that you don't miss out on any future One Piece discussions. I'd also really appreciate your help in getting to 100,000 subscribers. If you'd like to help the channel out further, you can also become a Patreon or channel member like these wonderful people. But as always, I just really appreciate you being here. So thank you for listening to another one of my ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.